Hello, and you're listening to Eco Justice Radio. We present environmental and climate stories from a social justice frame, featuring voices not necessarily heard on mainstream media. Eco Justice Radio acknowledges that we recorded this show on the traditional territory of the Ahachimen people in the place we call Southern California. Welcome, I am Jack Ite. On today's show, Seeing Through the Smog, How Big Oil Manipulates Climate Science. We feature an interview with Rebecca John, an investigative climate reporter at the Climate Investigation Center and the news outlet DeSmog, which focuses on topics related to global warming. Rebecca John is a research fellow at the Climate Investigation Center and a freelance investigative climate reporter. Her work has been published on DeSmog and Airmail and featured in the Guardian and NPR. Before working on climate, Rebecca was an award-winning documentary filmmaker and has produced films for PBS and the BBC. The Climate Investigation Center was established in 2014 to monitor the individuals, corporations, trade associations, political organizations, and front groups who work to delay the implementation of effective and popular energy and environmental policies that are necessary in the face of the ongoing climate crisis. In this episode, we welcome Rebecca John as she uncovers a series of alarming revelations about the oil industry's manipulation of public perception and climate science. We delve into the historic context of the oil and gas lobby, exploring how entities like the Western States Petroleum Association have influenced research and public opinion since the 1950s. From the origin of the Air Pollution Foundation to the ongoing battle against climate change, Rebecca sheds light on the intricate web of misinformation and the urgent need for public action. So stay tuned. This is one of those shows where we really sort of unpeel the layers of history to show how we ended up here in trouble in a climate emergency. I'd like to welcome Rebecca John, research fellow, investigative climate reporter at the Climate Investigation Center in DeSmog, coming to us from London with, pretty serious series of revelations that she has been uncovering about our friends over at Big Oil and the history of all they want us to learn. They want us to figure out what's going on in the world. And so we need to unpack what Big Oil has been doing really since, your investigations go way back. I want to start with just this. I saw this quote from Albert Einstein. Now I know a lot of times Albert Einstein gets attributed to quotes, so I could be fact-checked, but I like the way this sort of sums up the harsh reality. An oligarchy of private capital cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. That's what we tell ourselves that we have, because under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main sources of information. That's according to Albert Einstein. And that's kind of what we're looking at right now. This is a cabal of well-funded entities who started a long time ago, and it's still happening today. It hasn't changed one bit. So starting from that exciting perspective, let us know how you jumped into this. Like, where was your starting off point?
Yeah, well, hello. Thank you very much for having me. And I'm definitely not going to argue with Albert Einstein. So agree with that.
You shouldn't.
Yeah, that would be a foolish thing to do. No. So where did I start? Well, interestingly, just to rewind a little bit, I was researching what the US government Air Pollution Division in the Public Health Service in the 1960s knew about the carbon dioxide problem. And I was researching material at the National Archives, the US National Archives, to see whether an awareness of the harms of carbon dioxide and climate change was affecting any of their decisions, and whether it was being discussed by what was the sort of foremost entity within the US government for tackling the air pollution problem. And yes, alongside big pollutants that we know, the other air pollutants, they were building increasing knowledge of carbon dioxide. But in these records, which stretched back to the 1950s, I found some material relating to this obscure sounding foundation in Los Angeles that was started in the early to mid 1950s and wound up 1960, 1961. So already this was history by the time the Public Health Service were looking at the work of the Air Pollution Foundation. But in the records, there was a list of projects that this foundation had sponsored in terms of air pollution research. And one of them referred to a project at Caltech using carbon isotopes. And this just really piqued my interest because I knew that at that point, scientists were using carbon isotopes to unlock the secrets of the universe, to find out how old the Earth was. And this Caltech lab actually dated the Earth to around 4.6 billion years using lead isotopes. And they were using carbon isotopes to assess whether concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere were changing, because they could tag molecules, atoms of carbon in things like tree rings, and assess whether this carbon that had been absorbed by the tree was ancient carbon or modern carbon. So whether it was a fossil fuel, ancient, or newly minted carbon that had just come in, from the atmosphere. So I did think, what was this Air Pollution Foundation doing with carbon isotopes? Were they sponsoring climate science? So that's really what led me to the California story, and to just pull on that thread and see what was behind it.
Yeah, it's what an interesting. I think what you seem to be uncovering is this series of front groups. We have an entity right now that sort of seems to run things over here in California, as well as Oregon and Washington. Maybe there's other states that might be considered Western states, but the Western States Petroleum Association. Now, it had a different name back then, but these groups are lobbying groups. So how did it start from, and they had another name at that time, Western Oil and Gas Association, same concept.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Tell us about how these entities start up, because didn't it emanate kind of from that entity, or is that?
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. So yes, there's the Western States Petroleum Association, then known as Western Oil and Gas Association. It's the oldest oil and gas lobby group in the US. It actually began with the name the Los Angeles Chamber of Mines, and it's had several name changes over the course of history. But in the 1940s, this group, let's call them Whisper for short, they stepped in to represent the oil and gas industry in the face of challenges that they were confronting due to the LA smog crisis. So, as most people are aware, LA suffered from a terrible smog beginning in, the early to mid 1940s. And this problem increased with the rapid industrialization of LA following Second World War. And by the early 1950s, the smog crisis was really at boiling point in terms of the residents of LA protesting against the conditions that they were suffering, on almost a daily basis. So it got so bad that the governor was called in, and the governor suggested maybe, possibly closing down all the oil and gas refineries in the LA area. Workers had to leave their offices in downtown because the conditions were so terrible. It caused all sorts of...
Just to interrupt, I mean, people have to understand Los Angeles, we think of it as a movie town, but it really is an oil town. It has the largest urban oil field, probably in the United States, maybe in the world. And this is not new. It's been going on. You can look through history. People think, oh, Venice Beach, Santa Monica, Long Beach, all these romantic little beach locations. We have to understand that there's just oil wells everywhere in the old pictures. But so this history continues and into the central downtown spine. So there was massive level of oil production that was going on. And then it moved into processing and refining. And today, Los Angeles has a massive ground zero of production, processing, mining, refining, but also drilling. It's happening down in the harbor area, which is just straight south of downtown Los Angeles, between LA Harbor and Long Beach Harbor. And so the people were surrounded by these oil wells, often in their backyards. And of course, this was also a time when the private automobile was being ramped up. And, that Los Angeles had the famous red car system that some of the early suburbs developed upon. One of the places that burned, Altadena and Pasadena, they were created in the area of easy access to downtown Los Angeles via these red car light rail system. The oil companies mixed with the tire companies and the car companies all got together and said, what is it, this public transit? We need people to drive. It's America. It's freedom. We need to get out in your cars and, you people need to have some fun, drive down to that beach. Well, what they did, they said, this beach looks a little rough, so they put all the oil wells into hidden locations. Some of them they got rid of. So you go down to Venice Beach, you go Huntington Beach, and it's further south. These were all major oil towns, and they just they either hid them or, maybe they stopped drilling, whether they remediated. So this is going to create a lot of pollution. So that's your point, that smog. Well, Los Angeles has been famous for smog, even going back. I think you could look back to even during indigenous times when there's always a lot of fog in this area, and the fog mixes with the dust. We have massive amounts of dust, particularly when we don't get a lot of rain. So that's the early formation of fog. And when you fog with smog, which is I think where the term came from, smoke and fog. So this is the basis of a growing problem, and it's really is exacerbated by fossil fuels. So
Exactly.
continue
Exactly.
with your story of so they're responding to this smog crisis.
Exactly. So, exactly right. So, in about 1947, the Western States Petroleum Association decided that it would counter criticisms of its activities and counter the fact that it was being held responsible for the smog crisis by sponsoring science at the industry-funded Stanford Research Institute. And these industry-funded studies, well, guess what? They shifted the focus towards the weather. They sought to sow doubt around what was being called the hydrocarbon theory of smog that was developed by a Caltech scientist called Dr. Ari Hagensmith. And his theory was that when the sunlight reacted with pollutants, there was a photochemical reaction that caused smog. And the pollutants were exactly as you say, coming from the oil fields, the filling stations, the automobiles, and the refineries. So as the years went by, his experiments became more and more well-researched, and the evidence that the fossil fuels were the main cause of the pollution behind the smog became more and more solid. And so by 1953, when the smog season in the fall of 1953 was so severe that it caused, you had days and days straight of smog. I think it was something like 5 straight weeks of smog. And, this was terrible. People suffered appalling health problems, emergency admission rates went up, fatalities increased, even car accidents increased because people couldn't see where they were going. There was damage to property. Even if you were a healthy person, you didn't have an underlying condition, your eyes would stream, your throat was sore. It just became, living was horrible. Crops died. It affected every aspect of life. So in response to the uprise of social protest that we talked about in that autumn, people out on the streets demanding change, the Western States Petroleum Association appeared to have really realized that the science wasn't cutting it anymore. They couldn't argue it straight. People realized that industry had been funding that science and didn't trust it. So what we know is that at that point, WSPA became the driving force to establish this foundation called the Air Pollution Foundation, with the aim that it would sponsor and publish research ostensibly aimed at solving the smog crisis, and by influencing public opinion and regulators towards, a viewpoint that the industry wanted them to hold. So it would seek to shift the blame away from the oil and gas refineries, more specifically towards automobiles. It would argue for a technical solution that would be available at some point in the future, right? So they were saying, don't expect an immediate solution, but don't worry, we're on it. It made them look responsible. It just diffused the pressure, because they could say, just have faith and we'll get there. And it was launched with great fanfare. And, some of the newspapers actually reported it as a genuine citizens group, even though we now know that this, by far and away, the largest funder was the Western States Petroleum Association. And so there it is. It's set up to operate in 1953 as this protection for the industry from regulation of its activities. But what we do know from a memo that I found of, inside the foundation itself, is that, in fact, the Western States Petroleum Association founded it to be, and this is a quote, protective, and they founded it to be the research department for the oil industry. And the intention was that it would publish findings that would be accepted by the public as unbiased, in contrast to its own findings, which were not trusted. So we have all of that from an internal Air Pollution Foundation memo. And that really is like a blueprint.
Was this an ironic, it sounds like a joke memo, like,
no, I couldn't believe it when I read it. No, you see, it's one of those things that comes out when you have I know there's a sort of movie term for it, which is like exposition and ammunition. It's like when you get conflict, characters say things they wouldn't otherwise say. And what happened was, the first president of the foundation was an East Coast chemical engineer who probably looked like he was a safe pair of hands to run a front group for the industry. He had a background in chemistry, bringing products to market based on chemical, developments, a sort of commercial background. He was a World War I Naval Aviation Corps, pilot. He had been, and so he had.
What's his name? I have a couple characters here.
His name is Loren B. Hitchcock.
Okay, Loren B. Hitchcock. He was president of the Air Pollution Foundation. Now, this isn't a foundation. Now, when I think of foundations, I think of, the foundation, the rock, meaning they're raising money for something to stop oil pollution, right? But, and this isn't just guys sitting around in smoking jackets, figuring out, maybe they didn't have dating apps at the time. I'm not sure what they were doing, having drinks or something. But no, actually, this was the meeting of some of the most powerful business men at that time.
Yeah.
Who is present at these? Who's in the behind the facade of the Air Pollution Foundation?
Yeah. Well, I think the key figure is this man called William L. Stewart, William L. Stewart Jr., in fact, whose grandfather was the founder of Union Oil. So he's, California oil industry aristocracy, really. And he had been the first president of WSPA's Smoke and Fumes Committee, which was the name they gave to its air pollution committee, the task force that was set up to deal with this problem. And he is the most authoritative figure that you see behind the scenes of this Air Pollution Foundation. He went on to actually he took this air pollution fight nationwide. So in 1951, he actually warned the American Petroleum Institute, which is the industry's national lobby group, that he said, his words were, the policeman is coming, about the regulators, and wake up. And he then, very shortly after, became the chairman of the American Petroleum Institute's National Smoke and Fumes Committee. So as the air pollution problem was traveling outside of LA, but we're jumping ahead. So what happened was, we know that Hitchcock, the first president, was recruited with the help of some oil and gas industry members. So Air Pollution Foundation called on its associates and its network to find somebody. So we see that in the document. So they're keeping it pretty close to home. And they find Hitchcock, they set him up, And actually, however, he turns out to be a bit more genuine than they might have hoped, because he unrolls this very ambitious program of research. And he also starts talking about how there need to be investigations into refinery emissions, which probably must have, we know, set off warning bells through the whole California oil industry. He went up to the state capitol and gave evidence about how the state itself should fund air pollution research, which the industry did not want. They want to keep it very much in-house. And he even spoke out in San Francisco about the need for statewide air pollution control. So all these things would have been an anathema to his, Western States Petroleum Association funders.
I'm going to interrupt you right there, Rebecca.
No.
We need to go to a quick break, but we'll get back to all this intrigue building up around back in the 1950s that has led to the problems we're facing today. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially, environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org or socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/ecojusticeradio. Today you're listening to Seeing Through the Smog, How Big Oil Manipulates Climate Science. I'm your host, Jack Ide, and we feature an interview from Rebecca John, an investigative climate reporter at the Climate Investigation Center and the news outlet DeSmog.
Well, we're back with Rebecca John talking about all the fun people who hung out in the oil industry. She's telling us how the fun parties that they had where they talked about real issues. And then here was a guy who they thought they trusted to tell everyone, like, don't worry, just enjoy driving. This is America. He took serious some of their fake, propaganda press releases and started doing real research. Could you continue with that theme?
Yeah, of course. Yes. So a part of the research program that he oversaw, one of the projects was a research project for Caltech to potentially absolve the industry from the smog problem, because we know from a memo, an Air Pollution Foundation memo, that at this stage, although it was pretty much well proven that it was fossil fuels, the industry was still hoping that it could possibly, the pollution that was causing smog could possibly be blamed on backyard trash incineration. So they sponsored this study at Caltech, which was using carbon isotope technology that could assess and analyze the carbon pollution in the atmosphere above LA to see whether it had the molecular atomic structure of ancient fossil fuel carbon or modern carbon. And if it was modern, then they knew that it would be backyard trash. And that would have been a big help to the industry for trying to shift the blame for the smog crisis elsewhere. Well, spoiler alert, it was the fossil fuels. But in the course of that process, the Caltech scientists wrote a proposal to the Air Pollution Foundation that spelt out a bit more the bigger picture about this scientific, a sort of technique that they were using. And so the Caltech geochemist, Samuel Epstein, who wrote the proposal and sent it to the Air Pollution Foundation, wrote that in their work, they were seeing signs of a changing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere caused by the burning of fossil fuels, namely coal and petroleum. And not only that, he wrote that this changing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere could, in future, with reference to climate, prove to be of considerable significance to civilization, which is extraordinary because this is November 1954. The Caltech scientist issues what is, at the moment, the first documented warning directly given to the fossil fuel industry of the climate risk of burning fossil fuels. So it's the earliest moment that we see this on paper. Now, there were other people discussing it around this time, and there had been discussions in scientific journals. article published in Time magazine and the New York Times. And of course, scientists had known about this for at least 100 years before. But this is the first time that we know we can prove that the oil industry were notified, because the first president, Loren B. Hitchcock, published Caltech's research proposal in the Air Pollution Foundation's first technical progress report in March of 1955. So it laid out the entire thing, including the climate warning. And we also know through tracking the foundation's own internal records and its public statements, actually, that this first progress report containing the climate warning was sent to all the foundation's trustees, which included many of the major figures of the Californian oil and gas industry, and its funders, which we know included, again, many of the big companies that made up the California oil and gas industry and Western States Petroleum Association. And just to put this in context, we're talking about the companies, some of which we know today, like Shell, SoCalGas, Southern California Edison, and some of the kind of predecessor companies of the other big oil and gas companies. So, for example, ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron. So these are names that we're still very much familiar with. And these entities were all, and their predecessors were all members of the Western States Petroleum Association and funders of this group that were warned about the climate risk of fossil fuels in 1954. Right. So along with all the other things that Hitchcock was doing, this presumably must have irritated them. So we do know that they called him into a meeting shortly after this progress report was published at the California Club in downtown LA, very exclusive, members only. And this is where they did all their business, like over nice white tablecloths. You can just picture the big automobiles, driving into the valet parking. So yeah, that's the scene.
A steak and lobster was served. Maybe filet mignon, of course.
Yeah. Oh, delicious.
Hopefully they started off with some serious martinis, because this is going to be a tough conversation where they have to bring them down to earth. So keep going.
Yeah. So Hitchcock arrives at the meeting and they start criticizing him for what he's been doing. They start, reprimanding him for calling for statewide air pollution controls, for calling for greater state funding of air pollution, for looking into refinery emissions. And that includes, sulfur dioxide, right? So we already known to be very toxic to humans and animals. And one of these guys, George Davidson from Standard Oil of California, which is now Chevron, says, well, in some cases, I think evidence shown that sulfur dioxide is beneficial to humans and plants. Which just sort of shows you where they were with their stance.
Well, as is carbon dioxide, it's a building block of the planet that we live on. But
yeah, I think, yes, exactly. At this point, you have toxic smog events happening across the US from burning too much coal. So, and yes, anyway, so they're not happy with him. And that's when he starts to push back and argue that, well, the foundation has really been strictly following its, its charter and trying to fulfill its duties. And then they say, okay, come on. And they pull out William Stewart, who's obviously the big gun. And he starts saying in no uncertain terms, look, we funded the Air Pollution Foundation. And I was present at that meeting where it was founded, on the understanding that it would serve as the research department for the oil industry, that you would serve as the research director for the oil industry, that it would publish findings that were, quote, protective, and that, its published findings would be accepted where our own findings were not being met with such acceptance. That's the term that is used. So Hitchcock's pretty perplexed by this, and he then goes back to the trustees. They have a big conversation about what to do. And they also criticize Hitchcock for conducting too broad a program of research, which suggests that this could be a reference to the climate admission in that first progress report, as well as other studies which were looking at weighing, public transportation systems, mass public transportation systems, and how that could help the smog crisis.
Right.
And then at this point, seemingly at William Stewart's request, one of the other key figures at Union Oil, now Chevron, is pulled in to criticize every aspect of the foundation's research program. And he does this in such an extensive way that he concludes that the only sort of real positive function it could serve is to act as a PR bureau, a first-class public relations bureau. He denigrates and dismisses pretty much all the research projects and says, well, this isn't useful, and why are we doing that? And that's replicating this. And so what happens after that is that the research program of the foundation was rolled back. And
Lauren resigned because
he resigned. Yeah, he was also sidelined to a PR and fundraising role, and he resigned shortly after. And then they appoint
good
somebody.
for him.
Good for him. Integrity. Yeah, it's lovely to see that. And then they appoint somebody who had a connection with the American Petroleum Institute. So, and after that, the whole tone of the foundation's publications change. It becomes much more political. It seems much more like a lobbying organization. And crucially as well, from the climate position, no subsequent reports published by the foundation refer to the climate risk of burning fossil fuels. And this despite the fact that the money that was given to Caltech actually sponsored Charles David Keeling's first measurements of carbon dioxide across the Western United States. And it was those discoveries that he made through this Caltech project funded by the Air Pollution Foundation that led to him seeing that there was this baseline of carbon dioxide that was uniform everywhere he went, which was a massive surprise because he thought that would change depending on the, topography of the land, whether it was desert or forested. You'd thought that it would be different where there were a lot of trees, right? Where there was the cycle going on on the 24-hour basis. But no. So everywhere he went, in the late afternoon, the measurements were around 310 parts per million. And that revelation led him to secure a grant from the US Weather Bureau, which led him to work at the Scripps Foundation in San Diego and go
this
to...
This is all Charles Keeling.
Exactly.
Yeah, the Keeling curve. This was right in the same era. That why don't we listen to... There's certain scientists we need to listen to. And so with all this push here, was it this turnaround of the Air Pollution Foundation? Foundation of air pollution is, of course, fossil fuels. So I guess they're well named. There's two things that, and I think this is what's going on today too, that that whole concept of we need information. Well, I think the connection between carbon and how it affects the climate, I think has been harder for people to jump on. But, anyone who hangs out around these refineries or sits behind a diesel truck who's idling, they understand this is bad for you. Okay. And even as a kid, I used to sit there and I'd look at the smoke from buses rising into the air, and I said, how can the planet just process this? I don't understand. Well, I had the right idea there. Of course, my father worked for Standard Oil of Ohio. I don't want to get into that here, but that's our economy is based on this.
Yeah.
So getting into this concept, my father wasn't an oil man. I just letting people know. But how come we weren't listening to the scientists in the 50s? And, how did we get here with all this?
Yeah. Right. Well, I think that we weren't listening to the scientists in the 50s. I think that in a way, the science, it was early days of how much the planet could absorb. It wasn't until 57 that scientist Roger Revelle had the understanding that there would be a limit to what the oceans could absorb in terms of carbon dioxide. And at that point, it became much more urgent to monitor this and to really understand, because if the ocean stopped absorbing carbon dioxide, that could present a huge problem and lead to a rapid acceleration of the greenhouse effect. And that is, of course, what we have seen over the last 70 years. However, I think with the Air Pollution Foundation, what you see, it's such an interesting little microcosm, because after Hitchcock resigned and that key moment, as I was saying, like the future reports that it published referred to carbon dioxide in terms of it being innocuous. The climate risk was not talked about at all. So there's a covering up of some of the understanding of pollution and what's going on, and an attempt to just deny the problem, for want of a better word, really. It is really, to call it innocuous is denying what they had been told about in terms of what the long-term future potential of carbon dioxide could be. We also see a representative from the California oil and gas industry who's intimately connected with all of these entities, Air Pollution Foundation, WSPA, and the American Petroleum Institute, calling carbon dioxide harmless at the first ever National Air Pollution Conference in 1958. So in a way, what you see is this playbook that the industry have used repeatedly since the 1950s to downplay or dismiss the harms of burning fossil fuels, including the climate risk, which is to use a front group to manipulate public opinion and to influence regulators and lawmakers to a position that is much more industry friendly, to deflect the threat to its business from concerns over, in this case, carbon dioxide, and potential regulatory measures that might curtail its activities, reduce its business operations, and affect profits. So this employment of the foundation, the Air Pollution Foundation in the 1950s, as this oil industry front group, which, it was early days, so you could see it had teething troubles. They perhaps, they hadn't done it before. This, I think, is the first example of a oil industry front group used to tackle the air pollution problem. But they, straightened that out, got Hitchcock left, they tightened up, control, and then they used it as a very effective tool. And it's one that we see being replicated throughout successive decades. So, for example, in the late 80s and early 90s, the oil and gas industry formed the Global Climate Coalition, which was aimed at preventing the US from ratifying the Kyoto Treaty. And that was at another crucial inflection point when the evidence of climate change risk due to burning fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases had become much more developed than it had been in the 1950s. But it's interesting that they went to meet that challenge using very, very, very similar tactics. There was another group, the Information Council for the Environment, which was a coal group, also sponsored by the Edison Electric Institute and Western Fuels Association, that was also very active in the late 80s, also denying the realities of climate science and affecting to shift political opinion away from support of any climate action. And it's something we've seen again and again. I mean, there's a gas industry group called Natural Allies, which seeks to, expand gas industry and
natural. They're natural allies. How are they natural? I love these names. It's like. Yeah. And they're very smart and or crafty, we could say, because maybe people aren't paying enough attention, but the naming is problematic. But we're going to take a quick break again here, but I want to talk about what's going on today, because this right now in the present, we're looking at oil companies. Well, let's just say fossil fuel companies spending massive amount. I have a number here, 115 million on front groups. That seems low, but there's other things that are being spent, and there's a couple of lawsuits. I mean, because we want to figure out how we can overcome this, and we need people to understand how to fight these things, because frankly, there are things that can be done to overcome this power that these entities have. So we'll be back in a bit with Rebecca John and the incredible work that she's doing on unveiling how part of how we got here with our addiction to fossil fuels, and a government and a business sector that makes it continue to happen. So we'll be back in a sec.
You're listening to Eco Justice Radio, a listener-supported media outlet. Please consider making a donation to ensure that we can continue to provide socially, environmentally driven content. Donations can be made at ecojusticeradio.org socal350.org. For an extended version of this interview, as well as other benefits, we encourage you to become a member of our Patreon at patreon.com/EcoJustice Radio. Today you're listening to Seeing Through the Smog, How Big Oil Manipulates Climate Science. I'm your host, Jack Ide, and we feature an interview from Rebecca John, an investigative climate reporter at the Climate Investigation Center and the news outlet DeSmog.
So we're back with Rebecca John talking the oil industry and how they function. They're serving lobster thermidor before they tell everyone involved that, look, you guys, get on board. So let's keep talking about it, because there's a lot of money flowing around, a little bit for lobster thermidor, but there's other scientists who are being paid to do studies. We often hear that climate scientists are the ones who are paid to make up lies, but there might be some issues. It might be the other way around. So how are you looking at some of these things that's going on today, not just in the 1950s?
Yeah, exactly. So I think what we seeing today is that, first of all, the industry has a long history of these kinds of activities. In 2014, a leaked PowerPoint presentation that was published, I think, by an NPR affiliate, showed that WSPA was sponsoring between 12 and 15 front groups. And this was a WSPA PowerPoint presentation. And they were more or less sort of congratulating or celebrating the fact that they were sponsoring an extensive number of front groups involved in the fight against clean air measures and also climate action in California and across the rest of the territory's western states. So we know that since that time, since 2014, so in the time since that PowerPoint presentation was leaked, WSPA has given $30 million to the groups that were mentioned. And these are groups that have been involved in some of the big fights, the Climate Superfund bill that failed to pass last year that would have made polluters, accountable to pay a certain share of climate damages in the state in California. That did not fail. And some of the groups that were opposing it were these kinds of groups sponsored by WSPA. And we also know that tax filings show that these front groups have received much larger amounts of money from sources that are not always clear, but around 115 million in that last 10 years. So it's a lot of money we're talking about. Yeah. So that activity continues up to the present day. And, you can trace that back to see what happened in the 1950s. And again, it's a through line directly between those tactics and the ones that they're using now. And I think that what the bigger picture, stepping back, what you see is that, on the one hand, there's industry polluting the physical environment that we live in with the pollutants that its operations emit, but also to defend those operations, their activities have polluted the information environment that we're living in. So there's attacks on the integrity of science that go back to its commissioning of industry-friendly studies at the Stanford Research Institute in the mid 1940s, and that research institute in itself was really the brainchild of one of the most powerful figures of the business scene in California, a guy called Athol McBean, who was one of the largest shareholders in Standard Oil of California at that time, and one of its board members. So that company is now Chevron. So he was part of the family that was involved, that was his sort of heritage of another big ceramic producing company, which also, it sounds like a nice, sweet industry, but in fact, it caused a lot of pollution, and the workers suffered, from enormous health complications due to the procedures at that time without the, so many of the safety features that we have today. So just going back to that, bigger picture, you can see this, in the climate denial era where, ExxonMobil firstly shut down its own in-house science on climate change, which was in fact, when we see that science now, it has turned out to be incredibly accurate, the predictions of its own in-house scientists.
This is the campaign that Exxon knew.
Right.
People
yes, exactly.
And when did they know? To timeline wise, commensurate with what this was going on in California? When did they fire that scientist to Exxon?
Oh, in the 1980s. I don't know the exact
1980s.
date.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's fine.
but
Regular, generally
I,
speaking.
yeah, exactly. That was when they were conducting the science, and they were saying, is this really as bad as it seems? And their own in-house scientists said, yeah, it is as bad. It's true. It's really happening. They gave a big briefing to some, very senior level executives, expecting that to engender a big change, perhaps in the company to become more of an energy provider rather than a, blanket oil and gas fossil fuel provider. But no, in fact, what happened was the company doubled down, shut down its science unit, as far as we know. And then, Exxon CEO Lee Raymond was famous for denying climate change publicly. And many studies have shown that the company, along with other oil and gas companies, funded what has been described as a machine of climate denial by.
So why? I mean, I think maybe all of us know the answer to this question, but when you're confronted with pretty significant information, why is the capitalist class unable to shift? Because they're supposedly like thinking of new business opportunities and being creative, but maybe they're just getting, they want to just coast and keep doing what they've been doing, and it's their business model. So why? Because in your research, you're looking at how they're creating this doubt, but really the people who are creating the doubt know the answers. So how do we get here? Because the denial continues. Right now, the EPA is considering Lee Zeldin, the appointed head under the Trump administration, is considering whether they even have the right to regulate climate pollution in a time when, I mean, let's just say tens of thousands of houses just burned. And, you could say it was just wind, it was just dry, but these things, if that was the only example, tomorrow there's going to be another superstorm. Then the day after that, the drought is going to be crazy. Then we will have, flooding. It's going to continue. There's no doubt. I think the better question, we kind of know how. What can we do? There's a landmark lawsuit in California, 2023, against the oil majors, many Western State Petroleum members, for their role in funding climate denialism. Is that way, hold their feet to the fire? There's also one in Oregon. Can you tell us about these things?
Yeah, I think that's true. There's sort of hard tactics and soft tactics, in the same way that the industry employs both hard tactics in terms of lobbying and aggressive, maybe smear campaigns against scientists, things like that, and the softer ones of advertising, public opinion, PR, all that, sponsorship to make their image look shiny and acceptable. And I think probably the same, if you're looking for what can be done about it, we could take similar tacks. So yes, so one of the routes is through litigation. And as you know, there's a California climate lawsuit brought by the state attorney general, Rob Bonta, which seeks to this climate deception lawsuit. So for misleading the public over statements about the safety or harms of burning fossil fuels. At the moment, the Western States Petroleum Association is not named as a defendant in the California suit. The American Petroleum Institute is, along with the major companies who are members of the Western States Petroleum Association, so Exxon, BP, Chevron, Shell, etc. But yeah, in Oregon, Multnomah County filed a suit that does name WSPA as a defendant, and particularly for its use of front groups. So that is interesting because, citing WSPA for its use of front groups to mislead the public over its members, the continued use of its members' products causing harms is the sort of gist of what that particular naming of WSPA is about. So yeah, it's not yet named in the California suit. Rob Bonta has said previously he's open to adding further defendants to it. So they might be included on that suit. That would be one way. That would definitely be one way. And also the climate superfund bill that would be passed through a state legislature. That could be another way of making companies contribute to the costs of damage caused by disasters that have been, made worse by climate change, by the burning of fossil fuels to.
So this is a state, it's not national, because
No,
we don't have
no,
the votes. The super
not yet.
fund would be the super fund to do more fracking, to do more natural gas. That's the super fund that we have
Indeed.
right now.
Right
So,
now.
and renewables have their problems, but when we start comparing a transition to cleaner sources, there are significant benefits and the science is there in terms of being able to transition to cleaner sources, but also we need to figure out how to get people to be using less.
Yeah.
And the public transportation angle that is embedded in this, that I mean, in Europe, they've done a little bit better job than they have in most U.S. cities in terms of that. But Los Angeles has come a long way since I do urban planning, and was fighting back when I was going to UCLA a few years back, that we really needed change how the city works. And a lot of that has come true in the years since, but we're still a long way away. And there's so much money, even in California, which is supposedly progressive, supposedly can be an exception to some of these unfortunate oil-oriented circumstances. It's still the oil industry. It has such power over a lot of these legislators, and at the state level and at the local level. We're still seeing massive amounts of drilling going on, and the processing is happening, and the refineries are in business. It's just there in Los Angeles and Long Beach, and this industry isn't going away while the city burns, and the world is facing probably the hottest year on record. So what's our outlook? We've covered a couple things, but what do you see from your research, like the best way forward to advise people what they should do?
Well, I think from the research, it's clear that there are currents, and these things come in waves. And the closer change is in view, the harder the industry pushed back. So it was easy in the 50s to deflect it, because it was like, well, we're not going to see changes till the 2000s, so we don't need to worry about it now. And that again happened in the 1960s, when the first results of the Keeling curve came out. And then, as the decades go on, it becomes more and more urgent. But with each time, the science is becoming more established, and the industry pushes back even harder every time. That was true of the sort of peak climate denial of the late 80s and 90s. And then, they switched to a sort of greenwashing in the 2000s as a deflection, and sort of looked to sort of be partnering up with environmental groups and to get on board with the change. But as soon as that pressure eased off, they, as we're seeing, things have not indeed genuinely changed. And now, I think in response to the growing climate emergency, who knows, maybe this is the last stand. It's becoming difficult I can't predict the future, but what I can say is that what has tipped the balance in the past is overwhelming one factor, and that's public protest. It's people getting out on the street. It's like in 1954, there were about 7,000 people protesting the smog in Pasadena and really demanding action. And it was that point that saw Hitchcock unroll the really ambitious research program. About 2 weeks later, it was all over the LA Times. It was all over the LA newspapers. So that was industry. Okay, we're going to do something. Yes, it was a front group, but still, it was clear that that was what rallied the action. And we've seen it again, exactly with the Clean Air Act. Like, apparently Nixon looked out of the window and saw all this millions of people on Earth Day, and thought, oh, this is a big thing. I need to get into this game. I need to show people that I have an environmentalist credential. Not that he really did, I think, deep down, but in terms of affecting to be, that's what happened, that he did certainly put that forward. And, I guess we had the People's Climate March what some have referred to as the Greta Thunberg effect, but that really pushed through the momentum that was behind the calls for the Green New Deal and then the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's that public protest that puts it on the table. So that alongside, I think, the understanding of how the industry responds, it's really important to be kind of literate in their techniques. It's sort of like a skill set that we all need to have in order to be able to see, okay, which point on the spectrum are we at now? Is the industry in like denial mode or deflection mode, distraction mode? Is it pretending to be a partner here? Like where are we on that spectrum, and what can we expect, and how do we then actually create a sort of an effective way of countering whatever it is that they are, pulling out of their very, 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 sophisticated and well-funded toolbox to, perpetuate the status quo as far as they would see it. But
yeah, and I think sort of people coming together and working together to raise their voice. It's sort of like, you have to put an equal and opposite to these powers of these front groups. They sound all good. They're out there regularly. They're putting out press releases to journalists, etc. Those of us who want to counter this stuff have to adopt some of those same tactics. And I've worked for a long time organizing marches, and we've done multiple people's climate marches in Los Angeles that I was involved in. We need more than marches, but there's marchers, and then there's people who are working on the legislative reality, and there's a lot of really good people who are doing that, and people who are on the local level speaking out against the actual drilling, the expansions of these refineries. So all of this stuff, we need people to take responsibility. You're not powerless. You're actually quite powerful. It's unfortunate, Willie, with saying you're powerful, it means you have to do a lot. You have to show up. You have to dedicate a portion of your life to counter this stuff. And unfortunately, you're speaking to one person who, would probably prefer to be on vacation in Cancun or something like that, drinking a margarita. But unfortunately, I'm here talking with Rebecca John, who's told us quite a lot of really maybe disturbing, but it also should be inspiring. We should really hear this information as just like, okay, what we need to do is we need to show up at the California Club and disrupt a little bit of that filet mignon and whatever else they're imbibing over there, and have them face reality. So, Rebecca, can you tell us how? I appreciate you coming on the show. I really appreciate the incredible work that you're doing, and hopefully you can continue to educate people on these methods. Can you tell our listeners how to find your work and support your work, and any other details you can share with us?
Yeah, thank you. So this particular series is published on the DeSmog website. So that's DeSmog, DeSmog.com. And I am also on Blue Sky. You can find me there, Rebecca John. I think it's Rebecca John 1, possibly, at Blue Sky. I should remember exactly. I can't remember. But I think just Rebecca John Climate Investigation Center should throw it up. So, and then I think also on the Guardian, they've covered some of my work too. So that's kind of that.
Well, once again, thanks for hanging out with us here on Eco Justice Radio, and really best of luck to you in all your work.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you for everything you do as well. It's wonderful to be here and talk to you today. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you to Rebecca John. And thank you to our listeners for joining us. This has been Seeing Through the Smog, how big oil manipulates climate science. For an extended version of this show, become a member of our Patreon or visit our website at ecojusticeradio.org. Please connect with us on social media at Eco Justice Radio, SoCal 350, and Wilder Utopia. If you like what you've heard and you want others to be informed, subscribe, share the episodes, and help us continue our efforts by joining our Patreon or making a tax-deductible donation to the show. project of SoCal 350. The show can be found on multiple Pacifica radio stations, all major podcast apps, and at ecojusticeradio.org. Executive producer and host, myself, Jack Eit, co-host Carrie Kim, and engineer and original music by Blake Quake Beats. And until next time, remember, the power is yours.